The day they moved into the neighborhood felt like the start of something good. The streets were quiet, lined with trees that were just starting to show hints of spring green. Houses had neat lawns, clean sidewalks, and an air of calm that made it easy to imagine a peaceful life. At first, everything seemed perfect, the kind of place where neighbors smiled at each other and kids played outside without a care. The new resident felt relief wash over them, thinking finally they had found a place that felt like home. It wasn't long, though, before the first notice arrived. It was a small envelope with a perfectly printed letterhead that read like it came from some official office. Inside, it said that the mailbox was the wrong color. The resident stared at the letter, confused. They had chosen the mailbox because it looked nice and matched the house. They hadn't even thought it would cause trouble. But apparently, it was against the rules. The letter didn't just politely ask them to fix it. It gave a strict timeline and threatened fines if ignored. At first, the resident thought it was a mistake and decided to ignore it, figuring maybe someone would realize it wasn't serious. A week later, a second letter arrived, almost identical, but this time with more force in the language. It said the mailbox needed to be corrected immediately. There were references to sections in a book of rules the resident had never seen. The feeling of unease started to grow. This wasn't just a suggestion or friendly advice. It felt like someone was watching closely, ready to pounce at the first sign of no compliance. They tried to brush it off, telling themselves it was just the way things worked here. But there was a nagging thought that maybe the rules weren't just rules. They were a way to control people. Soon, the lawn became the next target. The resident had kept it neat and trimmed, proud of how it looked, but another letter arrived, this one criticizing the height of the grass and the placement of some flowers. It was confusing because it had been cut only a few days earlier. Each letter seemed to arrive with a sense of authority, as though the person writing it had absolute power. The resident began to notice other neighbors quietly receiving similar letters. Some would nod politely when passing by, but said nothing. The unspoken message was clear. The HOA held power, and they expected obedience. The tension grew with every passing day. A knock on the door one afternoon revealed the HOA president standing there, clipboard in hand, looking stern. He inspected the lawn, the mailbox, and even the curtains visible from the window. He spoke in a firm tone, explaining that compliance wasn't just expected but mandatory. There was no room for discussion. The resident tried to ask questions, to clarify what exactly was wrong. But the answers were vague and often contradictory. It felt less like a conversation and more like an interrogation. After he left, the resident felt a mix of anger and frustration. Wondering how anyone could be held accountable to rules that seemed arbitrary, neighbors started to share stories quietly. Over coffee or in passing conversations, they mentioned similar experiences, letters about trash can placement, rules about holiday decorations, fines for tiny things that seemed insignificant. Most of them had learned not to fight back. The HOA had built a reputation for being strict, unyielding, and intimidating. Some residents had simply paid the fines without complaint, believing resistance was futile. The new resident, however, found the situation increasingly unsettling. It wasn't just about following the rules. It was about being controlled. It's about losing the freedom to enjoy their own home. Days turned into weeks, and the resident became more vigilant. Every letter, every email, every notice from the HOA was read carefully and saved. They began taking photos of the property to show that everything was in order, documenting the state of the lawn, the mailbox, and even the flowers that had been criticized. The act of recording these details gave a sense of small control in an otherwise frustrating situation. It was a silent way of saying, "I see what's happening, and I am prepared." The HOA seemed to sense resistance. Letters became more frequent, and the tone more aggressive. The resident noticed how the president and board members would patrol the neighborhood, walking past homes with a scrutinizing eye. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about asserting dominance. The quiet smiles and polite nods of neighbors contrasted sharply with the heavy presence of the HOA. A tension hung in the air, subtle but persistent, like a storm gathering quietly behind the clouds. Late one evening, the resident sat on the porch, reviewing all the letters and notices again. Each one seemed to build a pattern, a trail of overreach. The feeling of being watched, of having no room for error, was overwhelming. They thought about why this was happening. Was it pride, the need to feel important, or something deeper? Whatever the reason, it was clear that the HOA's power was more about fear than fairness. The resident felt a growing determination, realizing that simply following the rules wasn't enough. They needed to understand the system to learn how it really worked, perhaps find a way to level the playing field. The resident began quietly talking to neighbors, learning their experiences. Some shared horror stories of fines that doubled overnight or threats of legal action for the smallest mistakes. Others described subtle forms of intimidation, like surveillance cameras being pointed at homes, constant reminders of rules that seemed almost impossible to follow. It became evident that the HOA thrived on control, keeping residents in a state of anxiety so that compliance was automatic. The new resident listened carefully, realizing that most people had given up. But that didn't have to be the case. One afternoon, the HOA president showed up again. This time, the resident was ready. They had organized notes, pictures, and questions. The president, confident as ever, began listing rules and citing supposed violations. But the resident asked calmly for clarification for the exact sections of the law or the bylaws that applied. The president fumbled, giving vague answers, and seemed annoyed that someone would challenge him. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. It showed that the IT's authority was not as absolute as it seemed. There was a crack in the armor, and the resident realized it was possible to push back carefully, wisely, and without anger. Evenings were spent studying local regulations, HOA bylaws, and legal guidelines. The resident learned that not every demand made by the HOA had legal backing. Some rules were misinterpreted, some were outdated, and some were enforced selectively. Each discovery added to a growing sense of empowerment. The letters that once caused fear now became pieces of a puzzle, each one pointing to inconsistencies or overreach. It became a game of understanding the rules and finding where the truth lay. Despite the frustration, there were moments of quiet reflection. The resident thought about why people stayed silent, about the weight of fear, and about the courage it took to speak up. They realized that the neighborhood could be a community, but only if people felt safe to live without constant intimidation. It wasn't just about one person. It was about everyone. That understanding fueled a quiet determination. The resident decided that they wouldn't just be another silent resident. They would learn, observe, and prepare, not for confrontation, but for truth and fairness. The first part of this journey was complete. The resident understood the rules, the threats, and the fear the HOA tried to create. But more importantly, they began to understand the power of knowledge. They realized that while the HOA seemed powerful, that power depended on people not asking questions. And now, questions were being asked. The stage was set for what was coming next. The quiet, tense neighborhood was about to see that authority could be challenged, and that truth, carefully documented and calmly presented, could change everything. The resident continued their routine, maintaining a neat home and following reasonable rules while quietly preparing for what might come next. Each day was a mix of normal life and careful observation. They noticed small things, the way neighbors whispered about the HOA, the way letters piled up in some mailboxes, and the way the president seemed increasingly tense when residents showed even a hint of defiance. It was clear that the HOA's power, while visible, was not untouchable. The resident felt a growing sense of purpose. Realizing that patience and preparation would be key in the days ahead, neighbors started noticing subtle changes. The resident would calmly answer questions about the letters and notices, showing that they were not afraid. Some were inspired, seeing that one person could take a stand without confrontation. Others were cautious, waiting to see what might happen next. The dynamic in the neighborhood began to shift, almost imperceptibly. The aura of fear the HOA had carefully built was starting to crack, and that small shift gave the resident hope. Even with all the preparation and observation, the resident never let fear take over. They continued enjoying small joys, morning coffee on the porch, walks along the quiet streets, and the occasional chat with neighbors. But underlying these moments was a quiet vigilance, a readiness to act when the time was right. The journey was just beginning, but the first steps had already been taken. The resident had learned to navigate the rules, understand the threats, and prepare for a future where fairness could prevail. And in that preparation lay a growing sense of confidence. The kind that only comes from knowing the truth and being ready to reveal it when the moment arrives. As the sun set over the neat rows of houses, the resident felt a quiet satisfaction. They were no longer just a passive observer in this neighborhood. They were an active participant in shaping its future. The HOA might have believed they had power, but the resident had discovered something stronger: knowledge, preparation, and the courage to stand up quietly yet firmly. The story of confrontation and revelation had only just begun, but the foundation for what was coming next was already being laid. One careful step at a time, as days turned into weeks, the tension with the HOA grew stronger. The letters continued to arrive, each one more demanding than the last. At first, the resident had tried to ignore them, hoping that if they did everything correctly, the pressure would ease. But it became clear that compliance alone would never satisfy the board. They seemed to thrive on control, using rules to assert authority rather than to maintain order. The resident felt a mix of frustration and determination, knowing that understanding the full extent of their power, lack of, it would be necessary to navigate the situation. One morning, another letter arrived. This one was about the placement of trash cans. It was astonishing how precise and rigid the HOA's rules were. They dictated the exact location of the cans, the color of the lids, and even the time they could be placed outside. The letter implied a fine would be imposed if any deviation was noted. The resident felt a surge of disbelief. It seemed absurd that such trivial matters could carry penalties, yet the board's persistence made it clear they would not overlook anything. At this point, the resident realized that they could not just react emotionally. They needed a plan. The resident began keeping a detailed log of every communication, including letters, emails, and verbal warnings. They photographed the property, measuring distances and noting details about landscaping, mailbox color, and trash can placement. It was a meticulous process, but it gave a sense of control in a situation that had felt increasingly chaotic. Each piece of evidence became a tool, something to show that they were not the one in the wrong. It was a small act of empowerment, turning anxiety into action. Meanwhile, the HOA president seemed to become aware that the resident was not intimidated. During one inspection, the president questioned minor aspects of the property. But when asked for exact references in the rules, he fumbled. His confidence wavered, if only slightly, revealing that their authority was more about perception than actual power. The resident noted these moments carefully. It became clear that the HOA relied on residents' fear and uncertainty to maintain control. The more prepared the resident was, the less influence the board had over them. Neighbors started to talk quietly. Some were reluctant, fearing retribution, but others shared stories of fines and threats. One neighbor mentioned being told their garden decorations were unacceptable, even though they had been there for years. Another explained how the HOA had imposed a fine for a minor repair done without prior approval. The stories painted a picture of an organization that prioritized dominance over fairness. Listening to these accounts, the resident realized that the problem was not just personal, it was systemic. The HOA had created a culture of fear that affected everyone. Standing up could inspire others. During this period, the resident took to learning everything about HOA laws and local regulations. They read legal documents, bylaws, and municipal codes looking for inconsistencies or overreach. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Many of the HOA's demands were either exaggerated or unenforceable. Some rules had been misinterpreted, and others were not even included in the official bylaws. Each discovery added confidence and clarity. It became obvious that the board's power depended on people accepting it without question. One day, the resident received a particularly aggressive letter. It threatened fines for a supposed violation regarding the angle of the house numbers. The resident laughed quietly to themselves. The absurdity of the accusation was striking. They decided to respond, but not with anger. Instead, they carefully cited the official rules, showing that the complaint had no basis. Sending that letter was both nerve-wracking and empowering. For the first time, they felt that they could engage on equal terms. The board was used to fear and submission. Here was someone responding with knowledge and calm. As the weeks passed, the resident began to notice small changes in the HOA president's behavior. He seemed more cautious, perhaps realizing that not all residents would be silent. The other board members, too, were occasionally hesitant when enforcing fines. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but the resident recognized it. Their actions were making a difference, even if it was small and slow. The realization was encouraging. Preparation and knowledge could challenge the perception of power. In the evenings, the resident would sit at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork, letters, and photographs. They reviewed every detail, noting dates, times, and correspondence. It was tiring work, but it was also a form of strategy. They were building a case, not for revenge, but for truth. Each document was a piece of armor, each photo a shield against unfounded claims. The process became almost meditative, turning frustration into a sense of purpose. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to chat, often cautiously at first. They asked questions about the letters, about fines, about rules. The residents shared their observations, explaining what was required and what was exaggerated. Slowly, trust began to build. People started realizing that it was possible to question the board without fear of immediate reprisal. The quiet sense of community, which had been overshadowed by tension and fear, began to reemerge. The residents' approach was not about confrontation, but about clarity. That approach inspired others. One afternoon, a minor confrontation occurred. The president arrived to inspect the property again, and this time, the resident was fully prepared. They had documentation ready for every complaint that might arise. The president raised a minor point about flower placement. Calmly, the resident explained that the flowers were in compliance with the official bylaws and cited the exact section. The president hesitated, clearly caught off guard. It was a moment of validation. The resident had turned a situation that usually caused stress into an opportunity to demonstrate knowledge and composure. Neighbors witnessing the interaction quietly took note, realizing that authority was not absolute. As the weeks progressed, the resident began to see the bigger picture. The HOA's strength lay in intimidation and misinformation. By staying informed, documenting carefully, and responding with calm confidence, the resident could neutralize that strength. They also recognized that time and patience were critical. Rushing into confrontation could backfire, but steady. Consistent actions were building a foundation for change. Evenings often became a time for reflection. The resident thought about why the HOA behaved the way it did, why people allowed themselves to be intimidated, and what it meant to live in a community controlled by fear. The experience was frustrating, yes, but it also provided insight into human behavior, authority, and the power of preparation. The resident felt a quiet determination growing inside them, a belief that fairness and truth could prevail. Neighbors began noticing the difference. Some would approach for advice or reassurance. Others would quietly express relief that someone was willing to stand up, even subtly. It was a small, invisible shift, but it was meaningful. The perception of the HOA's power was weakening. The residents' approach, calm, informed, and precise, was slowly changing the dynamic in the neighborhood. People started realizing that the board's authority depended on silence. When silence was broken, their influence could be challenged. Despite the progress, the resident remained vigilant. They knew the board could still escalate, issue threats, or try to intimidate again. Each day was a balance between normal life and careful observation. They maintained the home, interacted politely with neighbors, and continued documenting everything. The act of preparation was both protective and empowering, a shield against fear and uncertainty. The resident also considered the future. The ultimate goal was not just to protect themselves, but to create a fair environment for the entire neighborhood. They thought about how knowledge, preparation, and patience could be used not only to respond to specific complaints, but to change the culture of fear. This broader perspective gave purpose to the daily work of documentation and research. It was no longer just about mailbox colors or lawn heights. It was about fairness, community, and the principle that authority should be accountable. One evening, the resident reviewed all the letters and photographs collected over the past weeks. The sheer volume was overwhelming, but it told a story of overreach, intimidation, and unnecessary control. It also told another story, one of resilience, preparation, and growing confidence. The realization was clear: the HOA's power was not absolute. By understanding the rules, documenting evidence, and remaining calm and composed, it was possible to challenge their authority. That knowledge brought a quiet sense of empowerment and anticipation. The resident felt ready for the next steps. They had learned the patterns, understood the threats, and gained insight into the HOA's tactics. They were building a strategy not for confrontation, but for clarity and truth. The small victories questions that left the president uncertain, explanations that referenced bylaws, and the quiet trust of neighbors were building momentum. Each moment was a preparation for what was to come, a step toward revealing the full truth. In the quiet of the night, the resident reflected on the journey so far. What had started as a frustrating series of letters and fines had become a learning experience, an opportunity to understand rules, authority, and human behavior. The resident felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just for themselves, but for the neighborhood. They realized that fairness, once established, could create a community where people felt safe, respected, and empowered. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid, and the next stage of the journey was coming into focus. The HOA's confidence in their power was growing, unaware that the resident was quietly preparing to reveal the truth. Step by careful step, the weeks of careful observation and documentation led the resident to a point where they could see the HOA's patterns clearly. Every letter, notice, and visit revealed more about how the board operated. It became obvious that the HOA's authority was built on fear, uncertainty, and the assumption that residents would not question anything. The resident knew that to challenge them, it wasn't enough to follow the rules or react emotionally. They had to understand the rules fully, find the inconsistencies, and gather solid evidence that could not be ignored. The resident spent hours going over bylaws, municipal codes, and previous HOA decisions. They discovered contradictions in the rules, and even cases where the HOA had acted beyond its authority. Each discovery strengthened the sense that the board's confidence was based on assumption rather than actual legal power. For the first time, the resident felt a real sense of control. Knowledge had become a tool, transforming what had been intimidation into an opportunity for clarity and fairness. During this period, the HOA continued its relentless enforcement. Letters arrived more frequently, often citing minor issues like uneven garden stones or slight variations in paint color. The resident remained calm, documenting each claim and comparing it against the official rules. They took photos, measured distances, and even recorded dates and times to ensure every detail was accurate. It became a routine, a blend of normal life and careful vigilance. The process was time-consuming, but it brought peace of mind. They knew that if the HOA tried to escalate, they had the facts ready. Neighbors began noticing the residents' careful approach. Some quietly admired the methodical way they handled the letters and visits. Others were cautiously curious, asking questions about how the resident managed to stay calm while the board seemed aggressive. It was during these conversations that the resident realized the full extent of the HOA's impact. Many people had stopped participating in community events or speaking up because of fear. The culture of intimidation had silenced voices and diminished a sense of community. The resident felt a quiet determination to change that, not through confrontation, but through knowledge and clarity. One afternoon, the HOA president visited again. This time, the resident was fully prepared. Every potential complaint had been addressed with documentation and references to the bylaws. When the president pointed out a minor issue with the placement of a potted plant, the resident calmly showed that it complied with the rules. The president hesitated, clearly unsettled by the precise response. It was a small victory, but significant. It showed that when someone approached the situation with knowledge and composure, the board's assumed authority could be questioned without conflict. As the resident continued their research, they discovered even more inconsistencies. Some rules the HOA had cited were not part of the official bylaws. Others had been applied selectively, benefiting certain residents while penalizing others. Each finding was documented meticulously. The resident realized that they were not just preparing for personal defense, but building a case that could expose a broader pattern of overreach. The effort was both practical and empowering. It transformed anxiety into action and fear into determination. The resident also began to notice subtle changes in the neighborhood. Some residents started asking questions about the rules or seeking guidance on minor issues. Others expressed relief that someone was taking a careful, informed approach to the board's demands. Slowly, a sense of quiet resistance began to emerge. It was not loud or confrontational, but it signaled that the HOA's perceived power depended on silence, and silence was beginning to break. During this time, the resident received another letter threatening fines for a supposed violation of lawn height. The letter included references to sections that did not exist in the bylaws. Instead of panic, the resident smiled quietly. This was the evidence they needed to demonstrate that the board had overstepped. They prepared a detailed response, carefully citing the correct sections and providing photographs as proof. Sending the letter felt like a decisive step. It was a reminder that knowledge and preparation could neutralize intimidation. Evenings were spent reviewing all the materials, cross-referencing documents, and organizing evidence. The resident developed a system that allowed them to quickly address any future complaints. Each piece of evidence, each photograph, each note was part of a larger strategy. It was a methodical approach designed to challenge authority without anger or confrontation. The effort brought a sense of calm. The resident knew that preparation was more powerful than fear. Each day of careful work strengthened that belief. Neighbors began to notice the resident's dedication. Quiet conversations over fences or during walks revealed that many people were inspired. They saw that it was possible to engage with the board confidently and calmly. Some shared stories of past fines or threats, while others asked advice on how to document interactions effectively. The resident encouraged them, explaining that being informed and prepared was the key to reducing fear and protecting themselves. Slowly, a sense of empowerment began to spread, not through rebellion, but through knowledge and clarity. One day, the resident attended an HOA meeting. It was the first time they had actively participated rather than observing from a distance. The president began discussing routine matters and potential fines. The resident listened carefully, noting inconsistencies and vague statements. When the opportunity arose, they asked questions, calmly and precisely, referencing the bylaws. The president struggled to respond, and some board members shifted uncomfortably. It was a quiet revelation. The board's authority relied heavily on unquestioned assumptions, and when challenged with facts, their confidence faltered. The resident continued to refine their approach. Each interaction with the HOA was treated as an opportunity to gather information, clarify rules, and document any overreach. It was a careful balance of engagement and observation. The process was tiring at times, but it built resilience and understanding. The resident realized that authority, when based on fear rather than fairness, could be weakened through knowledge, patience, and calm persistence. During this period, the resident also began helping neighbors document minor issues. They shared tips on keeping records, taking photographs, and organizing correspondence. It was subtle, behind-the-scenes support, but it strengthened the sense of community. Residents began to realize that they were not alone. The board's power was not absolute, and that careful, informed action could protect them. The resident felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that their preparation was benefiting not just themselves, but others as well. As the weeks passed, the resident reviewed every letter, email, and notice received from the board. Patterns emerged, revealing a consistent approach of overreach and intimidation. Each documented instance of inconsistency added to a growing body of evidence. The resident began to see the full picture. The HOA relied on fear, selective enforcement, and assumed authority. Knowledge, documentation, and calm. Precise responses were the keys to countering that power. The resident also reflected on personal growth during this period. Initially, the letters and visits had caused frustration and anxiety. Now, they had become opportunities for learning, observation, and empowerment. The resident felt more confident, composed, and strategic. The experience had strengthened not only their understanding of the rules, but also their patience and ability to act thoughtfully under pressure. It was a transformation, turning a challenging situation into a platform for growth and preparedness. Neighbors continued to watch, some quietly participating, others slowly gaining confidence. The residents' example showed that it was possible to challenge authority calmly and respectfully. The quiet ripple of influence was beginning to spread, signaling that the board's control depended on fear, and fear was weakening. The neighborhood, once silent and cautious, was starting to feel a sense of possibility. The residents spent nights organizing evidence, planning responses, and reviewing bylaws. They knew that a confrontation or challenge would need to be careful, precise, and factual. Every photograph, note, and letter could serve as proof. Preparation had become a shield, transforming anxiety into strategy. The resident felt a quiet anticipation, knowing that the time to reveal the full truth was approaching. Each step of observation and documentation had built the foundation for what would come next. By the end of this period, the resident had not only prepared themselves, but also subtly influenced the neighborhood. People were beginning to understand that the board's power was not absolute. The resident had turned intimidation into an opportunity for clarity and community. The HOA continued its activities, unaware that the perception of authority was shifting. The residents' patience, careful planning, and calm persistence had created a quiet, growing challenge that the board had not yet noticed. Knowledge had become power, and preparation was the key to transforming fear into fairness. The stage was set. The resident had the evidence, the knowledge, and the confidence needed to address the HOA's overreach directly. The next steps would require careful execution, but the foundation was solid. The weeks of observation, documentation, and quiet community influence had prepared them for the moment when the truth could be revealed. The HOA, confident in its power, was about to discover that authority based on fear and assumption could be challenged with facts, patience, and composure. The resident knew that the next chapter would be decisive, and they were ready. The day came when the resident knew it was time to act. Months of careful observation, documentation, and preparation had led to this moment. Every letter, email, and conversation had been cataloged. Every photograph and note had been organized. The resident had learned the rules, studied the bylaws, and understood the exact limits of the HOA's authority. Now it was no longer about reacting to threats or intimidation. It was about presenting the truth in a way that could not be ignored. The HOA board had scheduled its regular monthly meeting. The resident decided to attend. They arrived early, bringing neatly organized folders containing all the documentation. The atmosphere in the room was calm, but the resident could feel a sense of tension under the surface. Board members moved confidently, unaware that the meeting would take an unexpected turn. The president began with routine matters, reading out announcements and planned actions. But the resident was ready, prepared to address each item with clarity and evidence. When the president mentioned minor infractions and potential fines, the resident politely raised their hand. There was a brief pause, a flicker of surprise across the president's face. The resident spoke calmly, referencing specific bylaws and regulations. They explained, with clear evidence, how some of the fines and complaints were not in line with the official rules. Photographs were presented, dates and times were verified, and discrepancies were highlighted. It was not an emotional confrontation. It was a factual presentation, carefully laid out to show the truth. The president and board members struggled to respond. They had relied on the assumption that residents would accept their authority without question. Here was someone who had done the research, prepared the evidence, and presented it calmly and respectfully. It was disarming. One by one, the board members realized that their perceived power had been based on fear and silence rather than legality or fairness. The resident continued systematically presenting each point, ensuring that the facts were undeniable. Neighbors watched quietly, some leaning forward in surprise, others whispering softly. Many had felt powerless, believing that challenging the board was impossible. The residents' approach demonstrated that careful preparation and knowledge could change the dynamic entirely. The room, once dominated by the confident board, now had a sense of balance. The truth was being revealed. The authority the board had assumed for so long was being questioned with clarity and precision. One particularly contentious point was the mailbox color issue. The resident presented photographs showing compliance with the official rules, along with a clear reference to the bylaw section that allowed the color choice. The president attempted to argue, but the resident calmly showed that the complaint had no legal basis. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. It became evident that many of the complaints issued over the past months had been unjustified, and the residents' evidence made that clear beyond doubt. Another topic involved the placement of trash cans and garden decorations. The resident demonstrated, using measurements and photographs, that every complaint had been either exaggerated or misinterpreted. Each point was presented logically, without anger or accusation, focusing solely on facts. The board's usual tactics of intimidation and vague threats had no effect when faced with documented reality. The residents' preparation turned what had been a source of fear into a powerful demonstration of truth. As the meeting progressed, the resident also highlighted instances where the board had applied rules selectively, benefiting some residents while penalizing others. This pattern of inconsistency had gone unnoticed by most, but with the evidence laid out, it was impossible to ignore. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The president attempted to maintain composure, but the resident's calm and factual presentation made it clear that the board's authority had been overstated. Throughout the meeting, the resident remained composed. There was no shouting, no personal attacks, only clear, organized presentation of facts. This approach not only protected them from any claims of hostility, but also underscored the credibility of their case. Neighbors, once hesitant to speak, now felt a sense of empowerment, realizing that it was possible to challenge authority respectfully and effectively. The room's atmosphere shifted from tension to attentive observation. The resident then addressed minor fines that had been issued inconsistently. They presented evidence of past decisions where similar infractions were ignored, demonstrating that the board had acted selectively. This revelation sparked quiet murmurs among the board and residents. The board had assumed control through fear and silence, but the residents' methodical approach revealed the gaps in their authority. It became clear that many past complaints had been unjustified. The board could no longer rely on intimidation alone. The meeting continued, and the resident maintained their focus. Each point was presented logically, each piece of evidence clearly referenced. Board members began to realize that the resident was not an isolated case. This approach could inspire other residents to question unfair actions and demand transparency. The president's confidence wavered as the facts piled up, showing that their perceived power depended largely on residents' fear and inaction. The room, once dominated by the board's authority, now held a new balance, as the resident addressed each point. Neighbors gradually joined in, offering corroborating observations and experiences. The collective voice of truth grew stronger. What had started as a personal effort became a shared moment of community awareness. Residents saw that they could engage without fear, that rules and authority could be challenged when based on fact rather than intimidation. The HOA's aura of control was cracking, and the residents' careful preparation had been the catalyst. The president attempted to redirect the meeting, but the resident remained focused, continuing to present evidence with clarity and composure. Each point made was logical, factual, and verifiable. The president's arguments, based on assumptions and intimidation, no longer held weight. The resident had demonstrated that preparation, knowledge, and calm persistence were more powerful than fear and arbitrary authority. At the conclusion of the meeting, the board acknowledged several errors and inconsistencies. Some fines were rescinded, and procedures were reviewed for fairness. The residents' thorough approach had not only addressed personal grievances, but also improved transparency and accountability for the entire neighborhood. Neighbors quietly expressed appreciation, realizing that change was possible when approached with clarity and respect. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to cautious optimism. After the meeting, the residents spoke with neighbors outside. People were relieved and inspired. Many admitted they had felt powerless for years, believing that the board's authority was absolute. Seeing the residents' approach, grounded in evidence and patience, gave them confidence that fairness could be restored. The resident emphasized the importance of knowledge, documentation, and calm persistence, sharing practical tips on how to handle future interactions with the board. The quiet empowerment of the community had begun. Over the following days, the resident continued to organize documentation and communicate with neighbors. The sense of fear that had once dominated the neighborhood had begun to dissipate. Residents were more willing to ask questions, seek clarification, and engage with the board responsibly. The HOA, once confident in its absolute authority, now faced a community that was informed, vigilant, and prepared to hold them accountable. The residents' careful approach had demonstrated that knowledge and preparation could effectively counter intimidation. The resident also reflected on the personal journey. What had started as frustration and anxiety had transformed into empowerment, learning, and community engagement. They realized that patience, preparation, and a focus on facts were more effective than anger or confrontation. By remaining calm and informed, they had turned fear into action and inspired others to do the same. The experience strengthened their understanding of authority, fairness, and the importance of standing up for truth. Neighbors continued to express appreciation in small ways, conversations over fences, casual chats on the street, and quiet acknowledgement of the changes in the neighborhood dynamic. The residents' actions had not only addressed personal grievances, but had begun to restore a sense of fairness and community. The HOA's perceived power had been challenged, and the neighborhood had started to reclaim its voice in the weeks that followed. The resident maintained careful observation and continued to document any board actions. They remained calm and composed, aware that vigilance was necessary to ensure ongoing fairness. The neighborhood had learned an important lesson. Authority could be questioned respectfully, and knowledge was the strongest tool against intimidation. The residents' preparation had created a foundation for continued fairness and accountability. The experience had a lasting impact on the resident. They understood that change required patience, persistence, and careful planning. The quiet, methodical approach had not only resolved immediate issues, but it also inspired the community. The HOA board, once confident in its unchecked authority, now faced a neighborhood that was informed, prepared, and capable of holding them accountable. The residents' careful strategy had turned intimidation into opportunity, fear into clarity, and authority into a system of accountability. As the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, the resident felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Months of careful work, observation, and preparation had culminated in a decisive moment where truth was revealed. Authority was questioned, and fairness was restored. The experience had strengthened the community, empowered neighbors, and demonstrated that knowledge, patience, and calm persistence could overcome intimidation. The stage was set for a neighborhood where residents could live with confidence, fairness, and mutual respect. After the decisive meeting, the neighborhood felt different. There was a quiet sense of relief and renewed confidence that had not been there before. The resident, who had been at the center of the confrontation, knew that the work was not entirely over. Even though the HOA had been held accountable, maintaining fairness and transparency required continued observation and care. The resident continued documenting any correspondence or notices, ensuring that every action taken by the board could be checked against the rules. It was a commitment to ongoing vigilance, not out of fear, but out of responsibility to the community.